Good morning. So today it's been a long break. I know some of you really said they missed it, but so did I. So don't forgive my voice because it's long time I haven't spoken for a long period of time. I might be out of voice before a while. So today we look at the beautiful, beautiful Austria, beautiful for its landscape, beautiful for its architecture. Don't forget, we limited to the 18th century. And then as a second part, we'll talk about the history of porcelain, which started in Germany in the 18th century. So first, I want to give you an idea of something, an event that's going to be very consequential to Austria and actually the rest of Europe, but it happens at the border of Austria. It's going to be the Battle of Vienna. And I want to show you, to support that, here is a map of what the Ottoman Empire was at the end of the 17th century. In light green are the dependencies of the Ottoman Empire, but in dark green you can see it's pretty large and very close to Vienna. And what happens is that they really went for a push onto Vienna. And of course, if Vienna had fallen very quickly, the rest of Europe would have suffered the same problem. So let's look at some date. There were two events with the Ottomans in 1529, so not quite about 75 years after the invasion of Constantinople by the Ottomans. There was a first siege of Vienna. That was that attempt by the Ottoman Empire to capture the city of Vienna in Austria. This was led by Suleiman the Magnificent, who was the Sultan of the Ottomans, who attacked the city with over 100,000 men. This is huge for the time, while the defenders numbered no more than 21,000. Vienna was incredibly able to survive the siege, which lasted just for over 2 weeks. And Suleiman had to retire. In 1683, and this is what concerns
Can't hear you, Anne.
Anne, I've lost your share screen and I can't hear you.
Okay, you should be able to hear me again. Okay?
Yes, but we don't have your screen.
It must have been an electrical problem. So I'm coming back to my share screen. Here we are. Okay, that's too far. Wow, it went. Sorry. Let me go back to where I was. Okay, here. Sorry, here is the, no. There we are. So the second one was the Battle of Vienna that took place near Vienna on the hill on the 12th September after it had been besieged by the Ottoman Empire for 2 months. The battle was fought by the Holy Roman Empire led by the Habsburg monarchy and, what is very important, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Both were under the command of King John III Sobieski. And he is really the one who led, and incredible because these troops were not used to one another. And John Sobieski was apparently so smart in leading the thing that they were extremely efficient. At that time, the Ottoman army numbered approximately between 90,000 to 300,000 men. This battle marked really the turning point of the Ottoman Habsburg Wars that had been for 300 years a struggle between the Holy Roman Empire. And literally when the Ottomans were defeated, it stopped all the problem that had existed for 300 years. So let me give you an idea of the Habsburg who were reigning at that time in Austria. So we have the reign of Leopold I, that was between 1657 and 1705, that followed the successful defense of Vienna. And he was succeeded by Charles VI that you see here. Charles VI, unfortunately, wasn't too smart in his reign and relinquished many of the gains that the empire had made in the previous years. Of course, I'm talking on the side of the Habsburg when I say that. He, though, was willing to offer very good advantages in territory and in authority in exchange for the recognition, because he didn't have any male heir. He really fought hard to have the pragmatic sanction recognized by his states that authorized his daughter Maria Theresa to become his heir. Until then, the Salic law had been enforced, and Salic law prevented any female to become queen or empress. So he died in 1740, and we assume that he was poisoned by mushrooms. Succeeding to him is Maria Theresa that you see here, very strong personality. She became the empress, but interestingly enough, she married Francis I, who was a cousin, a faraway cousin. And together, believe me or not, while she was reigning, they had 16 children. She was supposed to cede the power to Francis and to Joseph, her brother, but she actually reigned as the absolute sovereign, and she ruled by the counsel of her advisors. She was at that time an extremely, extremely strong woman. When she died, she was succeeded by Leopold II. I'm looking for it, although I went through all that to make sure that you had. Leopold II was the brother of Joseph II. Here it is, Leopold II. So she was succeeded by him just for 2 years. And then Francis II became a king, here he is, until 1804. And he's the one that had founded the Austrian Empire, the first emperor of Austria. So I'm not going to go any further. You can look at that map as long as you want. And it goes all the way actually to some of actually the successors to the Belgian king down there. So as you can see, all these families marry between themselves. And so it's a big mix-up. Also, just to give you an idea, here is a map of the different ethnic groups of Austria-Hungary. This is in the beginning of the 20th century, but gives you an idea of, here we have Austria and Silesia. Then we have within the territory Bohemia, with Prague as being the capital, where actually the empire had moved using Prague as the capital in the 17th century, but then it came back to Vienna. Then you have Galicia, you have Hungary, you have Transylvania, Croatia, Slavonia, Bosnia, etc. So you can see it's a very, very diverse group of territories. So here's the map of the modern Austria, and I've circled the main sites that I'm going to show you. I didn't show everything, but obviously Vienna here, that's close to Neuburg, which is a beautiful monastery. The St. Florian, the same thing. Here we have Traun and Enns. This is another one. Admont is another monastery. Salzburg, I don't have to introduce it to you. And then Innsbruck, which is, by the way, often overlooked, but is a beautiful city. So going back to Vienna, one of the most beautiful buildings in Vienna is the Belvedere. This is a historic building that consists of two Baroque palaces, the upper and the lower Belvedere, plus the orangery and the palace stables. So there are different ones, and you have a pond, etc. It's a really beautiful place to visit. It is now, the Upper Belvedere is a museum where you used to have most of the Klimt paintings and others, by the way. It has been deprived of a couple of them because they went back to their original owners. The residence was built by the Prince Eugène of Savoy, who was one of the great supporter of the Habsburg, who was originally a French prince, but fought for the Habsburg. Here is the Upper Belvedere seen from the pond. As you can see, very pretty architecture, extremely classical in many ways, but then you have these pretty ornaments around the windows and ornamented roofline, as well as statue there that make it a more Rococo style, more 18th century. Inside, the painter, the Eugène of Savoy, gave some commissions to different painters, mostly Italian. This is Carlo Carellone, who painted the ceiling of the marble hall in what you call the quadratura style. And then you have here the staircase with different motifs of a white stucco. The biggest chateau in Austria is, of course, Schönbrunn. Schönbrunn, that was designed by Johann Bernhard Fischer von Erlach and Nicolaus Pacassi, was built between 1740 and 50. It is an enormous chateau. It was remodeled. Actually, it existed prior to the remodeling by Maria Theresa between 1740 and 50. She had received the estate as a wedding gift. Pretty nice. So when you look at it, it has a more neoclassical facade because Francis I commissioned the redecoration of the exterior in neoclassical style at the end of the century. It was from the 18th century to 1918, the residence of the Habsburg emperors. The name here should not be foreign to you because von Erlach did a lot of architectural works in Germany too. Here's the garden facade in Schönbrunn. And then, of course, that beautiful kind of yellow ochre color that used and is really kind of mellow. Beautiful gardens, as you can see. It was painted in the 18th century by Bernardo Bellotto. We saw Bellotto, we talked about him previously when talking about the Italian 18th century. Bernardo Bellotto traveled all over Europe, and particularly in Austria and Germany, and was known for his very faithfully rendered architectural settings that for us are extremely precious because it gives us a sense on how the surroundings looked, and as well as the architecture at that time, if it was changed in between. So you can see here the arrival of beautiful carriages, and everybody is waiting there. You have some monks standing there. So very lively courtyard. Of course, inside Schönbrunn is incredible and has a variety of style. Here is the great gallery that measures over 120 feet by 30 feet. As you can imagine, provided the ideal setting for the court functions, ball, receptions, and banquets. The tall windows face the opposite wall that is covered with mirrors. So of course, this is inspired by Versailles. The whole ceiling is frescoed, as you can see, with this very organic shape, typical of the 18th century Rococo, and were painted by the Italian artist Gregorio Guglielmi. These are, of course, all apotheoses of the Habsburg. Each room has its specialties, if you want. This is the Vieux Lac room, the old Lac room. This was used by the Emperor Franz Stephan as his study. The Maria Theresa had the Vieux Lac room remodeled as a memorial room. And so you can see these are the different portraits of Emperor Franz Stephan and his family. But what is beautiful all around is that black lacquer panels from what was Peking, so Beijing, that were set into walnut paneling and then embellished with a gilded frame. I think I have, yeah, so you have a better idea. So this is an incredible ensemble of lacquer panels. The portrait, by the way, is by Pompeo Battoni, the portrait was painted in 1769. Another room, the walnut room, is of course, takes its name from the beautiful walnut paneling. The gilt decoration and console tables are very typical also of the Rococo style. It's always, the Rococo has that elegance and grace that really the Austrian loved. And so Rococo was a very influential style in Austria. The Million Room is something else too. It was originally known as the Feketine Cabinet but then the room was then given the name of Million's Room after the end of the monarchy in reference to the precious palisander wood paneling. So they used that very precious wood. And the wood is actually, you have the panels, and on each of these panels are some pages of Persian miniatures that are framed by these very organic gilded frame. The manuscript showed scene from the private and court life of the Mughal rulers in India in the 16th and 17th century. Now, in order to make them fit in all these very asymmetric form of the cartouche, these miniatures were cut up and reassembled in a kind of a collage technique. It seems quite terrible when I think about it, but the ensemble of the room are magnificent. And here is an example where you can see what seems to be a fight of the Persian miniatures. Quite remarkable room. The Napoleon room, of course, that goes over the 18th century, but I wanted to show it to you anyhow. So when Napoleon occupied Vienna in 1805 and 1809, he chose Schönbrunn as his headquarters. And so this probably was his bedroom, and it's hung with tapestries all around. The portrait that you see here, by the way, is the portrait of his son. That is showing him gardening in the park at Luxembourg Palace. Unfortunately, as you know, the young duke suffered from tuberculosis and died at the age of 21 in 1832. His death mask is here opposite. Other rooms, two Chinese room, one that's called the Oval Chinese Cabinet with a lot of, again, lacquers and porcelain, Chinese porcelain, large temple vases. But then one that was remodeled later on became the porcelain room and has an incredible ensemble of porcelain plaques and porcelain objects. The yellow salon with the, I always love these literally almost central heating, you can call them. These were fire or heating devices, if you want. So they would have the porcelain or the earth, the ceramic projecting the heat, but were extremely ornate and absolutely beautiful. This was overlooking the gardens of the palace. This room was once the bedroom of the Emperor Francis Stephen and Maria Theresa in the early years of their marriage. Beautiful pastel colors, so typical of Rococo again. And then some painted rooms, which are called the Burgle rooms, with very striking mural painting. This is one of the jewels of Schönbrunn. As you can see, it is a suite of rooms, all painted. And these, most of them were inhabited by the children of Maria Theresa. So as you know, she has 16 children. She needed a lot of room for the children. The name Burgle comes from the painter Johann Wenzel Bergel, who rendered the plants and fruits based on nature studies. The gardens are exceptional. You have different fountains. Just again, this is all inspired by Versailles. Here's the Neptune fountain and the great parterre, and then the kind of glory at the kind of triumphal arch, in the sense when you look at it. The architect had designed a palace to be built on top of that, but that finally wasn't achieved. That glory, by the way, was destroyed in the Second World War, but was already restored by 1947. It now houses a cafe and an observation deck. Other structures in the garden, for example, this is the Palm Pavilion in the western part of the gardens. There is a pigeon hole, also some botanical structure to protect, as here they protect the palms that they only get out in the summer, but there are orangeries and other building. And then what you find in most of the palaces at that time is the fake Roman ruins, just as a capriccio, if you want, to the palace. So they had different kind of rooms, and sometimes ruins of a hermitage. This was called originally the Ruin of Carthage. And these are these follies that were designed by the architects and erected as part of the surprise, if you want, when you turn the corner and suddenly you find yourself with what looks definitely like Carthage architecture. In Vienna, we have also a very special church that dates back from the 18th century. This is the Karlskirche, also designed by Johann Bernhard Fischer von Erlach. It's a stunning church, particularly with these two columns on either side that obviously are inspired by Trajan column. The church itself is dedicated to St. Charles Borromeo, who was one of the great reformers of the 16th century. It was actually built after the last great plague epidemic, where Charles VI pledged to build a church for his namesake patron saint, Charles Borromeo. And so it's in English would be St. Charles Church, Karlskirche in German. The construction was completed in 1737, and they had at that time already altered many of the plan. The church has a direct line of sight to the Hofburg, which is the huge palace of the Habsburg, and not far from the two Kunsthistorisches Museum and Naturalhistorische Museum. It corresponds to a Greek portico, as you can see. So this is actually not the Rococo part of 18th century, but more the neoclassical side. And the two tower pavilions that you have there are, in a sense, more part of the Baroque, inspired by Bernini and Borromini. And of course, the dome with a very high drum, as you can see. Inside, you have the apotheosis of Charles Borromeo at the end, with the triangle with IHS. So this is all dedicated to Christ, Charles Borromeo going to heaven. The cardinal, Charles Borromeo is surrounded by the cardinal virtues. And as I said, you can see the ascension here is the ascension of the saints. And different colors of marble. But around Austria in general, there are a multitude of extraordinary abbeys, though most of them were dismantled in the early 19th century, as it was in Germany. But fortunately, most of the buildings, because Austria was very Christian, most of them remained intact. And this is one of the prettier. This is the Melk Abbey that surmounts the river, the Danube. And you can see these incredible buildings all around, monastic buildings surrounding the church. This is a Benedictine Abbey in the town of Melk. And as I say, what is spectacular is that when you do a cruise on the Danube, you can see it really surmounting the river. The remains of several members of the House of Babenberg are laid there. So here's again the Melk Abbey. As you can see again that beautiful ochre yellow. The abbey was founded in 1089 and was given by Leopold II Margrave of Austria to the Benedictine monks. And they built then, beside the palace, they built that whole complex. The today's abbey was built between 1702 and 1736. It is an abbey that had enjoyed a real great fame and also academic stature. So because of that, Melk managed to escape the dissolution under the Emperor Joseph II, when unfortunately many other abbeys were dissolved. And it also survived the Napoleonic Wars. Tucker, hold up. Sorry, he isn't used to doing it anymore either. So this is the inside of Melk Abbey with, again, in some painted piers, beautiful frescoes, and a great altar surrounded by very thin and columns with gilded capitals. The ceiling is entirely frescoed by Johann Michael Rottmeier. The pulpit is entirely gilded with a series of animals and figures of virtues and others. Staircase, this is in the monastic buildings, beautiful library, which was very central to the existence of the Melk Abbey, and then the magnificent spiral staircase. To the west of Melk Abbey is the St. Florian Monastery, also a very important monastery. Was founded during the Carolingian period. Then since 1071, housed a community of Augustinian canons that followed the rule of St. Augustine, of course. In between 1686 and 1708, the monastery complex was reconstructed in Baroque style. And then it also has a very large library that was begun in 1744, containing about 130,000 books, most of them manuscripts. Just a sideline, in January 1941, the Gestapo seized the facility and expelled the monks. And from 1942, the Radio Society of the Third Reich operated there. Here, as you can see, extraordinary organs. The priory possess 2 organs. This one is the Bruckner organ, contains 4 manual. For those that know organ, 103 stops and 7,343 pipes. Marble room, this is part of the monastic buildings, and of course the emperor himself had a lot to say because he would come and reside there from time to time. Beautiful staircase with white stucco and some frescoed medallion that lead to the library. And then the Turkish bed, quite an interesting thing. The Turkish bed was destined to the emperor, but you can see the motifs that respond right away to that recent a victory over the Ottomans, where you see Turkish prisoners attached to the corners of the bed. And there you have some of the valiant soldiers that defended Vienna. Another monastery is the Klosterneuburg monastery, also an Augustinian monastery of the Catholic Church. It is located in the town of Klosterneuburg in Lower Austria, so we go a little south. It also overlooks the Danube River. It was remodeled between 1634 and 45 in a Baroque style. As you can see, that with the very typical domes. It actually was supposed to be that big, but then this was just a plan, and unfortunately was never realized. With beautiful gardens and moats, as you can see. Inside, more Baroque than Rococo. You see a lot of stucco work, though, but a much more heavy type of style in architecture. Within the monastic buildings, the marble room that was leading, as you can see, to different apartments. And the Sala Terrena that is quite spectacular, with type of herbs or caryatid that are supporting these piers, if you want, that sustain the wall, the ceiling. This is quite an interesting room. It is being now turned into the shop, gift shop of the Abbey, unfortunately. Other beautiful apartment. This is the apartment of the emperor, with extraordinary marquetry works, you know, on the furniture. And again, these beautiful fireplaces. The dining room with tapestries. And I was mentioning to you Innsbruck. Innsbruck has lots of interesting things. Many, though, built prior to the 18th century. That's why I'm not going to show it to you, but this is where the Emperor Maximilian was buried, in another church than this one. It's an enormous monument. But as far as the 18th century, the Wiltenner Basilica is one of these extremely pretty church. On the outside, very simple, just that two-tone building with the yellow, ochre, and white. Very gracious window openings. I remind you again that Austria, as well as Bavaria, remained Catholic after the Reform. And so the churches are still Catholic churches. This is a very typically Rococo. I think it's a good contrast with the previous monastery that we saw, how this one is very gracious, elegant, very light, and all these very organic elements that frame different frescoes. Or even if you look there at the pulpit, it's extremely gracious. Within Innsbruck, we still have some of the old houses. This is the Helbling house, located in the old town. That original structure was built in the 15th century, but then it evolved very much with a new architectural styles in the following centuries. The Rococo is called icing-like. Rococo stucco was actually added in the early 18th century. Hebling is the name of the owner during between 1800 and 1827. Other places, this is a typical landscape that you find in Austria. Söhl, this is the view of Söhl, and a very small church that you find in Söhl, St. Peter and Paul Kirche, St. Peter and Paul, has that very modest outside, but a magnificent inside. And this is something you find in both in Bavaria and in Austria, is you cannot see the magnificence of the inside from the outside. In the same place in Söhl, some old inn, this is the old inn Postwirt, that shows you the typical wall paintings that you find all over Austria on the old houses and chalets. In the Tyrol, in the southern part of Austria, you have the church of Hattenberg. Again, very simple church from the outside, but incredibly highly decorated inside. Or the hut house, the town hall in Steyr, sorry, with the very decorated window around the windows. As you can see, pretty architecture, very gracious again. Another of the largest abbey in Austria is the Admont Abbey. This is a Benedictine monastery. It's on the Enns River in the town of Admont. This is the oldest remaining monastery in Styria, Styria being one of the state of Austria, it makes Austria. It contains the largest monastic library in the world, as well as a long-established scientific collection. The library hall that you see here, that was designed by the architect Josef Huber, is 21, let's see, make sure, 210 meter long and 42 meter wide, sorry. It's very pretty high, it's about 40 feet high. It contains 70,000 volume of the, what you see here, only 70,000 volume, the entire holding being 200,000 volumes. And Salzburg, of course, the Mozart's town, very elegant, very pretty, surrounded by these magnificent mountains, and then the castle on top. And as far as the example of 18th century, we have a few, but probably the most striking is the Collegienkirche that you see standing here, and that you find here, that was remodeled again between 1694 and 1707. This was for the local Benedictine university that had been founded in 1622. It is now part of the University of Salzburg. Very simple interior. This is typically for the Benedictines, they're much simpler. So it's very elegant, but not as highly decorated. Other typical decoration of the 18th century are these houses, like the one in Grieskirchen. And in Salzburg, this is where Mozart was born, on the side of the Universitätsplatz in Salzburg. And here it is in the summer with the typical geranium and other plants garnishing the windows. So here I'm going to take a little stop. We're going to open the gallery view. You can unmute yourself, ask me a question. Just have a chat, go stretch your legs, get some coffee or water.
And
Yeah.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
The libraries, do they still use those books?
of course. Yeah, because what happens is there are many of the books are manuscripts, so they are unique. And so these are very often research library. You know, they have books that barely exist anymore for the ones that have been printed. So these are very precious and definitely used by scholars. You don't have a card, let's say, as a library here in Phoenix to go and take out a book. You have to stay on the site to study that. But these are magnificent libraries. And Austria, probably Austria and Spain fight for some of the most extraordinary old library that you can find. Spain has some of these incredible libraries with tons of the rarest manuscript you can ever find. So,
Cool.
Any other question?
And I have a question. One of your slides, when you're showing the Melk Abbey,
Yes.
it mentioned that it was one of the abbeys that was spared
Yes.
from dissolution.
Yes.
What is the story behind this dissolution of abbeys?
Joseph II was a very, how can I say, lay person. He was anti-religion. He was a very strange character, but this happened in 1803, I think, in Bavaria. They did the same thing. You have to realize that these abbeys were incredibly powerful. Not only did they have the buildings, but they had a great part of the land around them belonged to the abbey.
Oh.
So in Bavaria, I think about a quarter of the land belonged to abbeys. And so,
So it was not a religious issue. It was really.
It's a financial, economical. Yeah.
Okay.
So in many places, that's what they did. Look at Henry VIII in England. He did the same, but much earlier. Around 1530 or so, he dissolved all the monasteries.
But the abbeys that exist still there in Germany, are they owned by the church or the?
They are. Most of them have been given back to an order. Don't forget that abbeys only are used by the Catholic Church. They're not by the Reformation, because you don't have orders in the Reformation Church.
Yeah.
So if they have they're given back to an order, it is, or they have become museum. Or in Bavaria, I have the example of an extraordinary abbey that was dismantled in 1803, and what happened is that only one building remained and the rest was used as a quarry. You know, people would come and take the stones and use them for other purposes.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that's been all over. That's been all over whenever, because it was easier to use an already cut stone than have to go to a quarry and do it all again.
That's interesting. That's a perspective we don't have in this part of the world. I mean, this is...
No, but you know, if you have any memory of what I said on the Cluny Abbey, which was the largest abbey at that time in the whole of Europe, at the time of the Revolution, it was sold to a guy in the next town, you know, and that church, it was absolutely huge. It remains only one tower, and it had 6 towers. The rest was used as quarries.
Cool.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
You're welcome.
One more question, Anne.
Yes,
What-
Jan.
I think you told us this before, but what's the difference between an abbey and a monastery?
That's a good point, and I can't remember what let me try to remember why. The monastery, you can have an abbey church within the monastery. The abbey is in fact the title of the head of the monastery is an abbey. You have the director, if you want, of the monastery is called an abbey. And so the abbey church is the church that belongs to the monastery. There is a particular, let me see if I can find, I know there is one thing that is particular to abbey, but the head of the monastery is always an abbey. So let me see.
Abbot.
Abbey. Okay, let me find abbey. Okay, the abbey is a type of monastery under the governance of an abbot or abbess and housing. So it's just a type of monastery. So I'm not sure. Yeah, I think they're pretty much interdependent. Is that the abbot is the head of the monastery. The abbey is the ensemble of the buildings there. Monastery is another term for it.
Maybe a monastery doesn't have an abbot.
Pardon?
Maybe a monastery doesn't have an abbot.
No, they do, because you need to have the head.
Yes.
You don't let monks living just by themselves without having a rule. So you have to have either an abbot or an abbess if it's for women.
Okay.
Yeah. Any other question?
Oh, one more question.
Yes.
Why? I've never seen those central heating, ceramic central heaters anywhere before. Is that only in Austria?
They must have existed in other places and just not being kept the same way. These are striking, the ones in Schönbrunn and in the other palaces are just superb. And they are very typical of the Rococo period because you can see them beautifully ornamented. But you find them in Bavaria too. I'm sure that they exist in France. Imagine, the fireplace was not as practical as these because you have a radiation of the heat through the ceramic of the fireplace. So these were more efficient than just an open fire. But they're beautiful, aren't they?
Yes.
They're very large. I saw some in Holland too, by the way. Yeah.
I wonder if they were introduced in the 18th century.
It could be.
Yeah.
Could very well be. And that's something I have to research. I don't have any earlier information on that. Because otherwise you've seen these huge Renaissance fireplace, in all the chateaus in France, you have these huge Renaissance things, but it probably comes in during the 18th century. Also that there is much more work on ceramics and porcelain at that time, and that's thanks to the Chinese. Okay, so I think we're going to start again. I'm going to mute you all again, and so you'll be finished earlier. Let me see. I mute you and I talk to you later. Okay, so we're now moving to the history of porcelain. The history of porcelain, of course, starts in China. I'm going to give you, sorry, it jumps, a few definitions before we start. First of all, what is porcelain? Porcelain is a ceramic, but it is made of kaolin. And kaolin is a different type of clay. It's super, super fine type of clay. And then next to kaolin are other material. And the big thing about porcelain, it is heated in a kiln to temperatures between 2200 and 2600 Fahrenheit. So much higher than the other ceramics. The etymology comes from the Old Italian porcellana, which means a cowrie shell because of its resemblance to the translucent surface of the shell. Characteristic of porcelain, and I'm sure you all know that, it's very strong, hard, it is tough, it has that beautiful real white color, can be translucent if you have a very fine porcelain, and has resonance. You can find little bells made of porcelain and has a lovely sound. It is very resistant to chemical attacks and thermal shock, which means you can put it in the oven and not having it just break. It has a low permeability and elasticity. This is opposed to soft paste porcelain. That is a good example would be bone china, vitreous porcelain, the New Sèvres porcelain. That's a different thing. That has to be fired at a lower temperature, 2012. It doesn't look like much, but it makes a difference, to 2282 Fahrenheit. The name kaolin is derived from the Chinese kaoling, which means high, rich, from the village near Jingdezhen in the Jiangxi province in China. It entered the English language in 1727 from the French version of the word kaolin, following François Xavier d'Entrecolle reports from Jingdezhen. And so this is really, Jingdezhen is the birthplace, if you want, of porcelain. Here are some examples of kaolin, and you have here a map showing you the main places where you find kaolin, including the United Kingdom. If you can see, Spain, Germany, of course, it is the first place where kaolin was found in Germany was in Meissen near Dresden. There is actually, they're missing a place there, it's in Limoges. They found a kaolin, the first place where they found kaolin in France. But as you can see, there are places in Turkey, Ukraine, Uzbekistan, and in Italy, not mentioning the United States, Mexico, Brazil. As you can see, it's a very white product. So when was the first Chinese porcelain made? It was made between, during the late Eastern Han dynasty, between 100 and 200 AD, during the Three Kingdoms period, 220 to 280, and then the Six Dynasties period, 589, and then to the Tang Dynasty, 618, 906. At first, they started with low-fired ceramic wares, earthenware, which is soft porous, and low-fired wares only 2000 Fahrenheit. As you can see, it's not that much more for porcelain, but enough that it makes a big difference. Stoneware that is fused and hardened at 2200 Fahrenheit. And then you have finally the high-fired ceramic wares, which is the porcelain made of kaolin, and pentutse, which is another additive to the kaolin, plus impurities, gives that plastic quality. They can press mold, so you don't do it by hand anymore, but literally in molding. And then you have the blanc de Chine, which is white porcelain, and the celadon with the green glazed. The term China, when we use in English, China porcelain, comes from the transliteration of Changnan, which was the old name for the porcelain town of today, Jingdezhen. The kilns, and the kilns are very important, as you know, because they allowed, first of all, a high production, and particularly these new kilns that were not just a one items, were very often what you call the climbing kiln. So you have, I show you two different kind of kiln. This one is the Shigariki climbing kiln. As you can see, the fireplace would be here, and then the heat, as you know, goes up, and it would go all along here. These would be closed, of course, but it would be, and so you can have different potteries. And then at the end, you had the chimney that would escape the smoke. So you find that the firewood is fed into what they call the dragon head, called the firebox, at the very low part and the beginning. And then you have eyes or stoke holes where you can add some firewood if you need it along the body of the kiln. As you can see here, the potteries are neatly stacked on shelves on top of each other and separated by wadding. And then this is the way they are going to cook. So I think these are really interesting. They look like caterpillars. The early wares were the yew wares, was fired in the dragon kilns. The yew glazing was made with a recipe using wood ash and clay, and probably some small amount of limestone. Firing temperature is thought to have been about 1000 centigrade or slightly higher. And the color of the glaze ranged from gray to olive brown. So this way is considered as the ancestor of the Song Celadon ceramics. And it was, at that time, they were made to imitate the bronze vessels, which were antecedent to these ones. The Jingdezhen ware, we have here one of these very early examples of the Xingbai glazed lamp, the Jingdezhen ware, and we find them very quickly exported to Europe, where you can see a very similar vessel here, lamp, but turned into a vase, and it became known as the Fonthill vase. So these, the Jingdezhen were porcelain produced in the vicinity of Jingdezhen. And so the Fonthill vase was the earliest piece of Chinese porcelain that is documented to reach Europe in 1338. And other example here are these beautiful blue and white jar made in Jingdezhen between 1271 and 1368. They started having a mass production of these fine and translucent blue and white porcelain. This was called, Jingdezhen at that time was called the capital of porcelain in China. Why did it develop so well? It was a combination of techniques, but also Islamic trade. The new way was made possible by the export of cobalt from Persia that helped them having that very nice blue color. At that time, cobalt blue was considered as a precious commodity with a value about twice that of gold. As you can see, actually, the decoration on this jar inspired by Islamic decoration. And here we have the blue and white jar of Ming Wanli, later piece. This is export porcelain. So they became so famous that they got a lot of requests from Europe, particularly in the 17th century. The Oriental porcelain had become a valuable export commodity in the China trade. That was mostly provided by the Dutch East India Company that were importing enormous quantity of porcelain into Europe. And of course, that became the privilege of the rich, as you can see. So this is on the left, the blue and white export porcelain. So you have, as you can see, jusqu'au bout. So this is one of the mottos of different noble families. So they would be given some motifs to be added to it, but you can see all the figures there are very Chinese. And then here you have the blue and white export plate with the coat of arms of a family. One, of course, on the Silk Road, one of the first place where the Silk Road arrived was Turkey. And so we have, what we find is it becomes very popular in the Middle East. And so it's going to be copied by the Turks, for example, in Iznik, which was producing these marvelous tiles that you find in the Topkapi and other in the mosques. And so, as you can see, this is not porcelain, it's stone paste dish, but copying very much the type of motifs that you find with the Ming plates. Same thing in Europe. They copy the Chinese porcelain. This is the vase alla porcellana, which is called the Medici porcelain. They were copied from the 16th century to later with that kind of faience blue and white technique to try to reproduce the blue and white Chinese porcelain. And of course, in the Netherlands, in Delft, beginning of the 17th century, having all this import coming to the Netherlands, they are going to try to copy it, but never with porcelain. It's earthenware, so it's a ceramic, heavier. You don't have the translucence, but you have the beautiful blue and white. At first, as you can see, they literally copy the motifs that they find in these exports, and then they will come to their own motifs. They're particularly going to become very valuable when the export from China will cease, and then they will get lots of requests. Sorry for that. As you know, it was so used in the Netherlands that we find it regularly in paintings in the 17th century, particularly the paintings by Willem Kalf. You can see the beautiful jar here that competes with the Venetian glasses. Or by Jans Davids de Haan. Again, you have these very nice dishes that are particular. They're actually called cackware. Why they call cackware is because that porcelain from China that was exported was carried by vessels, by ships that were contourning the South Africa. These ships were mostly Portuguese. And as you know, the southern part of Africa is a very dangerous place to sail. And a lot of ships literally sunk, and they still find lots of the cackware at that time. Crackware comes from the name of the ships that were called trying to find the name of that. Kahaks were the name of the ship that were carrying all that load. The particular Kakwe is known because of these, as you can see, motifs separated by small bands. And you can see that here, same thing. So you have these larger bands and then smaller one, very typical of what is called Kakwe. In part of the Chinese porcelain are, of course, the famille rose. You have famille verte and famille noire also, with médaillon, and all these very much adapted to the taste of the people that were buying it. And here you have delftware, so it's faience. It's not the porcelain, but copied from, again, Chinese import. So I mentioned the fact that the first place where kaolin, so the whole, as we know, the whole making of porcelain depends on kaolin. And it remained a secret in China for very long, until finally they were able to know what was making the difference with porcelain. Once they knew, they started searching everywhere in Europe where they could find the kaolin. And it is in Meissen that the first mines of kaolin were found. And this is going to really change. So there's a whole history that goes behind that. So at the beginning of the 18th century, the German Johann Friedrich Böttger pretended that he had solved the dream of the alchemist, if you can see, to produce gold from worthless material. When the King of Poland heard of it, he kept him in protective custody and requested him to produce gold. For years, Böttger was unsuccessful in his effort. And but at the same time, mathematician and scientist von Tschirnhaus experimented with the manufacture of glass, trying to make porcelain as well. So Tschirnhaus supervised Böttger, and finally in 1707, Böttger reluctantly started to help with the experiments by Tschirnhaus. And then when Tschirnhaus just died, the recipe had apparently been handed over to Böttger, who within 1 week announced to the elector he could make porcelain. Böttger refined the formula, and with some Dutch co-workers experienced in firing and painting tiles. And so this was set for the beginning of the manufacturing of porcelain. So they established a laboratory in Meissen, and the production started officially in 1710. So here you see the Meissen Cathedral, as well as the Albrechtsburg, the castle of Albert on the Elbe River. And this is the Augustus the Strong, who was the elector at that time at the end of the 17th century. This is what the porcelain manufacture looked like in 1869. So very large building for the time. And this is where you had the first production of porcelain. Same thing, it was a very big secret until some of the workers that knew that were paid by others left the manufacture and then leaked the secret, and people started looking around to try to find more of the kaolin. So here is the way a two-story porcelain kiln with furnace looked in the end of the 19th century in Sèvres. Will remain this time only within the Germanic states to talk about porcelain. We'll talk about the others when we reach the country. Here is one of the very early vases dating back to the Böttger period, 1713 to 20. And of course, I put on the side the signature, if you want, that's what you find, the mark for Meissen. And so it's two crossed swords that you can find. So here with the different dates, it's going to change later. And it has been copied, of course, and forged. I'm going to show you a few really nice examples of porcelain from Meissen. These are the hard porcelain teapots around 1720, still with Chinese motifs, which is interesting. And it could be that they actually decorated it. They would send white porcelain somewhere and they were decorated in the Netherlands a few years later and then refired. Now, the one thing that is interesting, two colors are really very difficult, cannot be fired at such high temperature. It's red and gold. Both of them have to be painted after the others at a lower temperature, otherwise they change color. They haven't been able to get a red that stays at the same high temperature as porcelain is fired. Here is a wine pot in the shape of a peach. This dates back 1725. Now, Auguste the Strong wanted to produce large-scale animals for the Japanese palace. This is one of the buildings that he had around his palace, one of the follies. And he wanted to house his porcelain collection in that building and wanted large animals in porcelain. That was really difficult. So this is as big as they came. These are the lion and lioness. Look pretty sad. I think both of them were part of these animals that were to be housed in that Japanese palace. And the size is not very large. It's 21 by 13 inches. A little later, we have the name, of course, of people that painted it or shaped it. Adam Friedrich von Löwenfink, a vase. These were a large scale for a vase. So this is 15 inch by 10. Still Japanese or Chinese motifs. Later, we now find the inspiration is going to come from France. And this is a watch case by the Glashütte watchmaker. And now it is inspired by Watteau, by paintings by Watteau. And we can see similar type of motifs with the young lady reading and the flutist trying to charm her while her young lover is at her feet. So these are the kind of decoration that we start seeing. So moving away from pure chinoiserie. And of course, the famous figures of Meissen, and that will be copied later on by Dresden Porcelain and others. This is a figure of a bagpiper around 1750. These are extremely fine. If you look at the fingers and the whole detail, absolutely beautiful. And the dancing harlequin, these are part of nice collections. Now, a very interesting group of figures that came about at that time were the monkey band. And this has a really interesting history, is that each of the noble families who had a chateau or whatever had to show their standing by having a small band or a small orchestra within. And of course, some were extremely good, but some were very pitiful. And one day, one made a comment about somebody else's band and said, you know, they are not better than monkeys. And that gave an idea to one of the porcelain maker to make a band all populated by monkeys. They're now extremely collectibles, and they are absolutely adorable. As you can see, you have the clavecinist there, you have the conductor, you have the cellist, the violinist, you have singers, you have the trumpet, this is not a trumpet, anyway, whatever. Here you have an old instrument. They're absolutely beautiful. I'm going to show you some details. Look at the details of the faces and the costume, the foot that is raised. And this one, I have to show you I'm going to move it here. Yeah. The one had the harpsichord, and you can see he's riding on another monkey, which blows into to give him more sonority. They are absolutely superb, and so they go up to 40 in the group. Going back to more serious presentation, but obviously I have particular weakness for the little monkeys. These are set. This is, of course, the very famous blue onion pattern, the Zwiebelmuster from Meissen. And one of my very favorite is the swan service. The swan service, which is a very large Baroque Meissen porcelain made for the first minister of the Electorate of Saxony, Heinrich von Brühl. And then that worked also for the King of Poland. So he was the supervisor of the Meissen works in 1733. And so he commissioned that swan service that has been called the most famous high Baroque production in Meissen porcelain. This is a triumph of modeling and firing and the most fabulous tableware conceived. As you can see, you have not only big tureens like this one, but look at the plate. This is the stand for the tureen. And so it has embossed in the bottom the swans that really make the theme. And you can see a heron flying in. Look at the work, the magnificence of the work of these swans. The service consisted of 2,200 individual pieces. The designer spent 3 days in the Royal Natural History Collection, where he drew all kinds of shells and examined all the design. Now, these, as I say, was absolutely incredible. The swan service seems to have been by way of a wedding present from the king for Brühl's marriage in 1337. It was used for the service à la française, used at the time, required large numbers of pieces of tableware, up to 80 to 100 different dishes. Meissen still possess the mold of that service. Unfortunately, about half of the service appeared to have been lost in World War II, particularly when the Soviet Red Army occupied the Schloss Pfürten, where it was, and where the main part was stored, and it was unfortunately burned down. But they used some of the pieces as targets in a kind of a clay pigeon shooting. Just to give you an idea, London auction prices in 2015 include £31,250 for a teacup and saucer, £18,000 for a slop bowl, $6,875 for small fragments of 3 chandeliers. And I saw myself, there was a plate for sale some years ago in an auction, and it went for $50,000. Here are some more of that extraordinary service. Another famous service is the Mühlendorf dinner service, designed by Frederick II the Great. As you know, he was quite an artist, loved to compose music and to write poetry, and of course, design porcelain. Royal Vienna is so we're moving away from Meissen. So this was the second factory in Europe to produce hard paste porcelain. It was founded by Claudius Dupaquier, who died in 1751. And he was assisted by the former kiln master from Meissen. So they were able to find some kaolin, and they established a whole manufacture, their factory that was quite original. And so you have a different, as you can see here, these are the marks for that porcelain. It looks like a beehive, a tulip vase on the left, and a beautiful tureen with cover on the right. Höchst is another, move this back here. Höchst is another porcelain factory that followed Vienna in the 1740s and 50s. And it was actually workers from Meissen that typically started. This is a beautiful ensemble of the audience of the Chinese emperor. And look at the delicatesse of these figures. You can see when it's really a good piece, not a later piece, just by the finesse of the hands. That's the detail that should confirm that you have a high quality piece. Nymphenburg in Bavaria. Here you have the Harlequin and Harlequina. And here's the mark for Nymphenburg. This is just out of Munich. And so this gives you, we will go through the English porcelain when we talk about England. And we have already talked about Limoges and Sèvres in France. So hopefully this gives you an idea of what porcelain. Few people typically know where porcelain started in Europe. I thought it would interest you. I'm now going to stop the recording.